Okay, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
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 Thank you. We were just saying, as soon as there's the title, profitability, for some reason everybody thinks it's a rather dry subject, and if it's creativity and building things and those kind of things, we have a packed hall. But obviously profitability is one of the reasons that we're all in this business. If we can't maximize profit, we can't generate returns for owners, then frankly, we're not going to be too long in the business going forward. So today's session is about benchmarking, profitability, productivity, all of those different areas. And before we go into that, I'd just like to welcome you to the session. Thank you very much for being here and giving your time this morning. I'm Jonathan Humphreys from HOCA, so I'll be hosting the panel for you. We'll have an interactive session, hopefully. We're going to use the Slido app this morning, so please feel free to post your questions. I'd like to introduce the panel. We have Jonathan Langston from Hotstats. We have Shona Whitehead from Congenta Blue. We have David Hart from Redefined BDL. And we have Anthony Brister from Marriott. And I'd like you to give them a big warm welcome and welcome to the stage this morning, please. Thank you. And obviously, I think, introductions are helpful. We're going to keep it brief, but I think in terms of the context of the topic that we'll be covering this morning, it's helpful if you understand a little bit about their experience within this area and what they're doing on a daily basis. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Jonathan to give you a very brief background about himself.
Thanks, Jonathan. So the hat I'm wearing for this session is as co-founder of Hotstats. Hotstats is the only provider of detailed monthly profit and loss performance. We currently report on 85 line items. We draw the data from a general ledger extract, which means it's all consistently posted and reformatted, so it takes away some of those obstacles that people have about full profits performing, and we will gradually extend that with an ambition to 550 line items, so allowing for enormous detail in profit benchmarking. So that's what we bring to the party as an aggregator.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Shona?
So Shona Whitehead from Cogent Blue. We work with hotels mainly in the commercial and technology fields. So revenue management, sales, marketing and distribution, and also hotel business systems and infrastructure. I've been doing this for over 20 years, working in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, and hopefully I can share some of the knowledge I've gathered today to help you in your businesses. Thank you.
David.
David Hart from Redefined BDL Hotels. Been in hospitality for 15 years, from student accommodation all the way up to 5-star. Been on property and had a number of central roles. Redefined BDL operates 67 hotels on a third-party operator basis, so benchmarking costs and that kind of thing is obviously very key for us in our business.
Thank you very much, David. Anthony?
Good morning, Anthony Brister, Area Director of Finance for the UK and Ireland for Marriott. I've been with Marriott 4 months, so I'm still at the stage whereby if I get asked something that I don't know, I can say I'm still new. But I'm being told that that time period's rapidly expiring. I joined the hospitality industry just about 9 years ago and spent 8 years with Hilton. So a lot of my time is obviously as finance lead for Marriott in the UK, is spent with owners, asset managers, but primarily leading and driving the performance of the finance teams.
Thank you very much, Anthony. So hopefully you can appreciate this. The panelists have a different lens on the business given their experience. We've put a question up on Slido for you. It's a poll question. If you have the chance to have a look at it, it's around the KPIs that you may or you use currently to look at your businesses. And we're just quite keen to kind of get that feedback so that we can maybe talk about that a little bit later in the session. The topics that we're going to be looking at, kind of big picture topics, we're going to be looking at benchmarking, best practices. We're going to be looking at drilling down and getting transparency on cost of acquisition of the business, which is a very opaque area at the moment. And Shona's going to have a look at that for us. David's going to have a look at the role around technology, systems, and data, and Anthony's going to also contribute to that discussion, looking around the efficiencies of operations and services as well. So without further ado, I'd like to ask to kick off this session, which is, there's a whole opportunity around benchmarking. And I'd like to ask Jonathan, at the moment, what do you see as, best practice? Where is best practice benchmarking within the industry? Where are the opportunities? How are people using data from your perspective? And, also the role of internal versus external benchmarking.
Sure. So I think one of the challenges is there is a lot of data out there, and there's a lot of data in different silos, and I had it referred to last week as different puddles, which I thought was a great analogy, because there are lots of puddles of data, both on an internal basis and on a sector-wide basis. And those puddles are not forming a great big lake that everybody can drink from, because we can all learn from what we do in other businesses. So I mean, the typical response I get to the benchmarking question is, well, I can't really benchmark my business because, I provide bathrobes, so that makes me different from any other business. Well, really. And how do I use the data? Now, so it's got to be consistent, it's got to be comparable, it's got to be regular, and it has got to be detailed. So I think now the data technology is there to achieve that, and we're seeing a big change in mindset to doing that. So we're seeing more sophisticated data analysis coming into the market, a thirst and a desire to understand and get to the bottom of some of the nuances of the data, and also to benchmark against the wider competition. A lot of people say to me, we have all the data that we need internally, which is quite a myopic viewpoint, because back to my puddle and lake analogy, if you know what's happening in the entirety of the universe, then you can pursue what is patently the best performance, and then understand how to get to that best performance. And the more data you have, the more granular you can go into identifying best performance and striving to achieve it.
That's a great summary, Jonathan. I mean, Anthony and David, within your businesses, in terms of benchmarking, kind of how are you seeing best practices along those lines? Is taking general ledger extracts helpful in terms of that kind of benchmarking, or what KPIs are you using in that respect?
Well, I think the utilisation of benchmarking is very sporadic. Actually, I think the big game changer that I'm seeing at the moment is the interest in our ownership in terms of our benchmarking using external data. So, for instance, the data that's available from Hotstats, rather than just talking about how we benchmark the performance of our hotels internally. As I mentioned in my introduction, I've been with Marriott 4 months, and certainly over the course of the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've had conversations with 2 of our significant owners in terms of them wishing to see Hotstats and Hotstats benchmarking performance included in part of the reporting and the discussion we have around the financial performance of our hotels. And I think having that ownership focus and our ownership pushing that agenda is going to give real value, and we'll see the benefits of that coming through in financial performance. Whereas in the past, when we focused on internal benchmarking and kind of picking up and putting down Hotstats data when we've wanted, it's never really driven the position any further forward.
Mm-hmm. So is it helpful in terms of making it more objective, in terms of planning, in terms of what you could potentially do with the hotel going forward? Also, I guess, David, in terms of, some of the typical budgeting is kind of like looking at last year and then just making some kind of incremental change going forward. And I guess if you've got some kind of best practice benchmarking, it's probably quite helpful in terms of, layering in some kind of real plan of action of how to achieve, future budgets.
Yeah, I think for us, we're very much a kind of zero-based budgeting company, and I think all our GMs would even agree with that. Our benchmarking approach has historically, I think like Anthony said, mostly been internal. Where we've looked externally, it tends to be kind of one-off exercises. Now, the nature of our business means we get access to a lot of data rooms for hotels or portfolios that are for sale, and that really gives us a good sight into what our competitors are doing, maybe more directly even than something like a Hotstats would. I think there's an interesting disconnect for us between revenue benchmarking and cost benchmarking. In virtually all of our management contracts, there's termination provision around revenue performance and RGI performance specifically. So an owner can get rid of us with no compensation if we don't hit a certain RGI percentage, but there's no profitability termination provision at all, which is potentially a bit strange because you could be underperforming in revenue, saving a huge amount and more than hitting the bottom line, and you could get kicked out, or you could be achieving in revenue, dropping it all, God knows where, not hitting the bottom line, and then they can't do anything. So there's a real, I think, misunderstanding in the industry of what potentially is possible from a benchmarking point of view. And that even goes into, to use hot stats probably as the live example. We've got some contracts where we have to subscribe to hot stats and we have to get the reports, but one, we don't use it, two, we don't report on it to those owners, and three, they never actually ask us about anything in relation to it, even though it's in the contract. So there really is a kind of disconnect on that compared to revenue benchmarking, where STR is widely used, everybody knows it, virtually every hotel contributes to it, and it goes like that.
I mean, I guess it's part of the legacy of the industry that it's been very much about RevPAR and the transparency of data, and everybody's been able to provide that information historically. And I guess giving general ledger has probably been a bit risky, but now it's starting to come together. But I guess one of the nice things about going forward is that the transparency exists, especially around cost, right? Because I think one of the things that we're seeing in the business today is kind of where we want to really look at where the cost is building. And, you know, we've obviously seen, you know, greater share taken by, you know, OTAs and the commissions, et cetera. But I feel like that's only really part of the picture, Shona. So, you know, in terms of, you know, the opportunity for, you know, looking at cost of acquisition of the business, because you could have, for example, you could have a great segment of business that's got great ADRs overall, but ultimately it could be extremely expensive for you to acquire that business. And on the contrary, you could have cheaper business, which has a very low cost of acquisition, and actually that business could be more profitable. So just from your experience, what are you seeing in terms of, you know, those kind of trends, and how do you see them kind of moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I think the whole cost of acquisition question is really interesting because it tends to focus very much on commission, and particularly with the rise of the OTAs, and we all know whether we call that a problem or a gift, it's the commission that we focus on. But the cost of acquisition really goes way beyond that, and we try and work with clients and encourage them to go into the levels of saying, okay, what are your transaction costs? Do you have an annual cost for your CRS service, for example? Are you getting bookings delivered in a two-way interface or a one-way interface, or is there manual intervention there? And they're therefore looking at every individual channel and working out the costs of acquisition for those channels, right down to the marketing that you spend on that channel, the level of resources that are required for you to manage that channel. And the reason that's important is that you're learning from what's happened in your business. You're using that information to manage your channels in a more profitable way. And that should be feeding into your whole budget process as well, in terms of saying, how can I manipulate my strategy, not just on a rate basis, but on a profit basis as well. And, you know, we've had some examples where, you know, I worked with a client very recently that they were really struggling to get resource to cover voice reservations. It was a leisure-based client, a very complex business. They sell lots of activities, so the voice service is important to them. And they just couldn't get staff in their location to cover at night. And they were reluctant to go out and use an outsourced service because they're saying, oh, the commission from the outsourced service is really expensive. When we then drilled down to say, actually, your own voice service and your own direct bookings that you're getting is costing you the same as the commission that you would get from the outsourced service, it really helped to give them an additional revenue stream, improve their conversion, but understand at a far more granular level what the costs were for all the different channels. So I think it really should be a focus area and hasn't particularly been in the past.
Can I just, Jonathan, can I just pick up on
of course,
the RevPAR point? Because I think, you know, RevPAR was and remains a great performance indicator. I think it had huge popularity because previously an increase in RevPAR normally cascaded to the bottom line. Pre-OTAs, pre-lots of other costs, it was a really good bellwether. And it's still a great tactical indicator of how the business is doing. But I think it's caused a bit of a disconnect between owners and operators. And what we're seeing now is operators now really wanting to get back to a much more aligned relationship with their owners. And you can only do that by talking about profit. And that is then reconciling, well, what is happening all the way through the P&L? What is it costing us to get those increases in RevPAR? You know, over the period 2000 to 2015, there was a huge increase in RevPAR, which was great because everybody kind of looked at the RevPAR line, everybody happy. But of course, and the thinking was still RevPAR is going up, that's great. But actually, there was an inexorable decline in profitability for all sorts of reasons. We saw OTAs come into the market in sort of the early 2000s. There were big increases in the cost of utilities, which really hit the P&L. But do you know what? RevPAR was going up, so it didn't matter. Minimum wage, national minimum wage got brought in, another impact on the bottom line. And all these things have caused profit erosion. So for the long-term health and for that healthy relationship between owner and operators, as well as the capability of data technology now to provide what is so important about that consistent and comparable data, it's all coming back together to really, and David, the point I would make, as I've talked about it before with you, is, you know, you pick up an acquisition opportunity and you get a glimpse at one point in time of how that business performs, but we have the uniform system of accounts. It's a great benefit to the industry. No other industry has it. It's anything but uniformly applied. So you don't know what's being posted until you go back to that raw data level. And I think it's where the data technology has caught up, which is facilitating that, and will start to shift the focus all the way down the P&L.
I think one point, maybe just can add to what Jonathan and Shona were saying, is we've just started working with a new investor, kind of private equity firm, and they've never been involved in hotels before. So they're really extremely data hungry and want to understand how it works. And they're sitting with us saying, right, every single channel you have, what's the profitability for them, or what do you think it's going to be for these hotels? We don't know, you know, this is where the industry's at, this is the level we do it to, you know, you've got commission and whatever else, but we don't have it in the level that they expect us to have it, and they don't have all the industry baggage of 20, 30 years investing in hotels. So that's been interesting for us to have to realise that we're going to have to deal with that and do something to address what they want to know about how we're trading the hotels. So that's a different approach for us that we're going to have to look at.
I think what you're saying there about that you don't have that information is that my experience is that no one does this well. And the challenge is you're dealing with multiple sources of data. So in cost of acquisition, you might have to get your transaction levels from your PMS. You might be going to your finance or payroll to get your cost of your resources. You may even be going back to your CRS and GDS providers and looking at the contracts and the OTA contracts. So you're dealing with multiple sources of data. There isn't a program or a system that pulls this all together and neatly spills out a cost per channel. And furthermore, even if you go to the extent of doing the whole exercise, which is a manual exercise but well worth doing, then applying that. So with a revenue management system, for example, the 3 main revenue management systems used in hotels in the UK, none of them build in cost of acquisition to their algorithm, and only one of them has on their development roadmap that they're going to even let you start tracking cost of acquisition. So it's an interesting conundrum, but if you want to understand the profitability, the exercise has to be done, and maybe initially manually.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense if we can get visibility over the whole supply chain of events from the original source all the way through to the end. It would just allow us to make greater commercial decisions or more valuable commercial decisions. So I guess part of it we're talking about some kind of it's systems integration, because what I'm sensing is kind of duplication of costs at the moment throughout hotels and throughout the industry. So there's an opportunity around systems integration, about bringing somehow all of this information together And then it's all about creating some kind of transparency around this and reporting that actually works for the right people within the business to make those decisions. So, I mean, in terms of your experiences, Anthony and David, around systems, I mean, where do you see the opportunity of these coming together, and also within the organization, you know, where does this need to be sponsored from? Because I mean, it sounds like it's like you're talking about kind of many different disciplines that at the moment they're kind of isolated or kind of have their own islands, and it's how you connect all these.
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, we have a number of disparate systems in the business. There are, at times, you view it that the business is operating in quite a silo mentality. If I talk about how I want systems to be brought together in terms of something like benchmarking, I want to see, and what our owners are talking to us about as well, is bringing together our kind of reporting in terms of actual performance, how we articulate what we're expecting to happen in terms of forecasts and looking forward, what systems we are putting in place in terms of labour management and labour efficiency. We heard quite a lot yesterday from the speakers about the change in the labour markets in the UK, the expectation that labour is going to become more expensive. So when I talk to owners and they kind of accept that we're going to see that increase in the cost of labour, then the conversation turns to efficiencies and optimising performance, etc. So I think there's going to be a technological requirement around that. Certainly the projects that I'm working on within Marriott at the moment are around forecast accuracy, a more rounded view of forecasting from revenues right down to profitability. And it was interesting what Jonathan just said a moment ago about understanding and benchmarking the P&L all the way from the top down to the bottom. I think, just to digress slightly, I think the questions that went out on the Slido app about the metrics that people recognise are probably more around, they're specific to this industry, aren't they? They are the parameters and how we talk about performance in terms of rooms profitability and food and beverage profitability. What I'm keen as the finance lead in the UK for Marriott is the total benchmarking of the total P&L. You know, it would be slightly remiss of me as the finance lead to challenge the people who are driving the operation without thinking about the structure and efficiency of finance within the organisation. And if you look at technology, I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago around above property cash allocation, bringing it back round to what Shane was saying about the cost of acquisition. One of the costs of acquisition that we have is actually recovering debt, isn't it? You know, we go and send all of this build debt out to guests and customers, and then we have to fund the cost of actually recovering that. And I think where technology can allow us to do that more efficiently and easily, and there are solutions out there, then I think that's going to bring great benefit.
Great. Okay,
For us, I mean, I think for us, we've recognised maybe kind of 3-4 years ago that we had, like you say, various systems with various reports being run, and in a number of situations you had two versions of the same number being reported in different places. And our approach to dealing with that was to go out and implement Cognos, which was both on a budgeting and forecasting side of things and also on a business intelligence side of things. And that's really been quite transformational for our business and has gained great buy-in from the GMs as well as a number of the central functions. It's not just become a finance tool, which was a key concern at the outset, but has proven not to be the case. But really for us, that's been because we just invested heavily in it in the management company. It was the biggest capital project the management company had ever done. So it was a bit of a punt to an extent from the shareholders, but it's proven to be very worthwhile, and we've continued to develop that and spend on running with that each year. Now, the way we use that from the BI side of things is we integrate all our internal systems to it, so there's only one number being reported for any metric. So rooms revenue is only coming from the accounting package, Sun. It's not coming from the PMS, whereas previously people were looking at a rooms revenue number in the PMS and in the accounting package. And so that's been a huge thing for us. The issue we've partly faced around that, though, going back to the point about systems integrating, is we've also tried to then go to third parties and get direct integration into them. So that's worked particularly well in some cases with like Opera and Brilliant, but where we run other branded hotels where, like Hilton or Accor hotels that have their own PMS systems, we can't integrate directly with that, and that causes us an issue because we then have to put a manual process in place to get the best extent of the data we can into our system. So it goes back to that point about all the data not really being available to be able to work with it. So yes, that's...
Yeah. So I guess the owners don't really, they're more focused on getting an output that they can actually measure the business with and make the right kind of investment decisions. And I guess how the industry comes together and provides a solution that they're less concerned about, but it needs to be, all of these different systems need to be talking together to each other. And I guess the other bit is it's all around, we've got static data, these kind of benchmarkings are done every so often, and then they're looked at, and maybe there's something, but I guess there's more a role of dynamic data, where you can actually move with the data. If it's all integrated, it's more then about taking action and analyzing rather than physically putting, it sounds like most of the role is trying to put all this data together rather than using it. And it's getting the balance right of being able to use and action on the data. We've just got we've got some results from the poll here, and I guess I'd just be, if you've had the chance to have a look at this, be curious. Claire, is this on one page or 2 pages? Okay, all right. So if we could start at the top, we're just curious. So obviously RevPAR is the biggest one, no surprise there. GOP percentage, NOP percentage or EBITDA percentage, that's also pretty interesting. Internal P&L benchmarking, RGI, okay, not surprising. External P&L benchmarking at 35%. Cost of room acquisitions, 1/3. That's pretty good. So a third of you looking at the cost of room acquisition in some shape or form.
That's more than the panel.
No, not Anthony.
NOP per available room, GoPAR, so roughly a fifth are looking at GOP per available room, which is obviously helpful when you're looking across various hotels. Hours worked per room sold. Now what we were keen to have a look at here, you can see the cascading almost from kind of revenue-based indicators through to profit-based one, but also then when we start to look at productivity indicators, and this is one of the things we wanted to touch on, and we had a discussion yesterday, and one of the things that became apparent when we started to think about, okay, well, what are the productivity indicators that really exist? If you look at other sectors, a lot of other sectors have a huge amount of productivity indicators. And so we just put one in there, which we have at the moment. I mean, you can argue most of those are some kind of productivity indicator, but we put in another one, hours worked per room sold. GOP flow-through. I mean, this is what you were talking about, Jonathan, in terms of,
and to be
RevPAR
fair to
growth.
David, something he brought up as well, that a really critical indicator for you in terms of your efficiency as an operator. And you're a very predictable audience, I'm bound to say, because I think we both said, well, we bet nobody really gets GOP to flow through. Really important when you look at the profit erosion, the costs of them that have been introduced to the business and actually have leaked out of the industry. And you can go on about the fact, OTAs are no longer disruptors. They've been around 20 years, they're here. We've got to work to look to other operational efficiencies to achieve that flow through. And that's the bit where you add to the top line, how much of that really has an impact on the bottom line. So the fact people aren't measuring it means it's not understood and therefore can't be acted on.
Yeah, I think that is interesting, and it's something that's probably the most looked at thing by our operational team when our kind of P&Ls come out, and really that's because for us flow through is a measure of the GM and the hotels taking control of the things they really can take control of once the revenues come in. So there's no point us as such beating them over the head on a profit number against the budget if all of the shortfall is stuff they actually can't do anything about. And that's historically maybe been a bit of an issue for GMs and kind of the operational teams. It's something we have in all our packs to owners, and I think I mentioned when we were talking about it yesterday that we talk to owners about it, but it's something we're not sure they entirely get or really understand the benefit of understanding, because maybe it's more about, well, you're shorter budget or you're above budget, rather than understanding that as an operator, you're doing what you can to make that number the best it can be.
So I guess, I mean, flow-through is helpful in terms of kind of the overarching topic here in a way, because it does cover a lot of these different areas, because essentially if you're getting business in and you're more efficient about how you're able to drive that through, and you're able to increase profits at a maybe faster rate than you're increasing revenues, then that's a good, it means that you're heading in the right direction. But I guess also, you know, how can, in terms of, you know, if we've got an audience of, you know, investors, hoteliers, I mean, if they're looking at benchmarking, at the end of the day, it could just be a whole load of data, right? And therefore, you know, what can, from a best practice perspective, you know, how can you learn from this kind of, you know, it's one thing seeing a trend, and then how can you act on that trend? I mean, do you look at like individual cases and say, okay, well, this particular hotel seems to be doing this fantastically well. Let's do some kind of investigative. What's the investigative analysis? What's the best, you know, what's a way of kind of using this to maximize the performance within the sector?
I think just, I guess, more of a traditional sense, but making sure that you've got your competitor set correctly if you're looking externally to your business. Are the competitors that you're benchmarking against your true competitors, and is really challenging yourself on that. And indeed, maybe having more than one competitor set, so having a stretch set, have a competitor set for your M&E business, having a competitor set for your spa business. So really challenging yourself on who are you benchmarking against and why, and then using that data to help you plan and strategies and tactics for the future, not just looking, oh, I'm up or I'm down, I'm happy or I'm not happy. That has to be data, insight, action, not just data.
Fair enough.
I mean, I think it's interesting you put it in the context of a single hotel. I think it's about a balanced scorecard approach, isn't it? And that's what some of my owners are saying to me. It's not all about, it is about profitability, but it's also about team member engagement. It's also about guest service. I was rereading the narrative in the programme that describes what this panel session is about, and it actually says cutting costs on one line. I think it's more about right-sizing costs and making sure that costs are as efficient and appropriate to the business as they can be. And certainly within Marriott, you know, we're just concluding kind of the first phase of our budgeting process for next year. And we are talking about some of the kind of structural costs that are actually in that business around IT and infrastructure, etc., in comparison to the size of some of the hotels. So I think that balanced scorecard approach, which is not just about slashing costs out, because we can all do that, can't we? We can all decide that we are not going to do public area cleaning on a daily basis, etc. So our metrics, when we compare ourselves, looks completely different. But the reality is we're not being efficient, we're just taking things away. So I think it's a more rounded approach.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, it's an observation. Obviously, there seems to be a greater move within the industry from the customer side as well towards experience. And, you know, there's more of a need for experiences within the facilities that we're offering. And yet what I'm sensing is that there's still a lot of focus, just because of need at the moment, on process. So I mean, it's not just about, I guess, cutting costs. It's actually about realigning where you invest within the business. If you're able to make things more efficient from a process perspective and integrate all these systems, surely you then can look at recreating the hospitality experience within the hotel to give greater guest experience. Isn't there an opportunity there as well?
Yeah, because it's also about growing the top line as well, and creative means of doing that. I mean, the data is very one-dimensional. It's about the implementable actions that arise out of the data. One of my favourite stories is from David Taylor at GLH, who talks about increasing productivity in housekeeping, which is when you look at man hours per room sold, all of those measures. Actually, what you want to do is to get the people who are the best at rooms cleaning. So they attach to what were known as their best housekeepers a couple of GoPro cameras to actually understand why they were the best people and then roll it out as best practice. We can talk here, you know, from an ivory tower perspective, if you like, just a data collator perspective, but it's all about how you then interpret and use it. And sort of the exciting stuff, believe it or not, is that this is much more sliced and diced now. So you can identify areas of best performance and then look under it to see what the human aspect of that is to achieve either best cost or best revenue practice. So you identify on an individual basis top performers on each line item and then make that your aspirational comp set, your single aspirational comp set in terms of internal benchmarking, and go for it. And it drives, it's a hearts and minds thing, drives efficiency and creativity throughout the business.
I mean, you get, everybody loves stories like this, but can have conversations with GMs when you're budgeting, and it's about, well, why is your linen per room sold KPI, I don't know, £2 instead of £1.50, whatever it is, and they can't understand why the average across their division of all the same hotels is much, much lower. And you say, right, okay, well, your budget's £1.50. I can't do that. I'm at £2, and you're like, well, all of your peers are doing it. And then immediately they go off and, they start to look into it, and it turns out that this ridiculous 4-pillow versus 2-pillow debacle that you get in particularly limited service hotels, but they say, well, I can't do that because my guests will think this is terrible. And actually, it goes back to your bringing your data together. Well, if you're looking at your guest satisfaction stuff, actually in a number of situations, you'll find out that the hotel with the lower KPI actually has equally, if not better, guest satisfaction services, because what maybe the hotel or the GM thinks is important to the guest might not actually be important to the guest, and that data piece really helps you to support that argument if you're talking to the hotels about it. So.
Yeah, I guess that just moves on to a bigger piece around just integrating, not just, we kind of started talking about performance benchmarking, KPI, but we're talking about customer data, insight. I mean, other industries just call it insight, right? They just bring everything together and they say, we need all this to create insight in order for us to make better business decisions, and that's what I'm hearing here. Are there any questions that you've posed? Because I think it'd be nice to, I don't know how much time we have left, but I'm quite keen that you have the opportunity to pose any questions on the app there. Can I just wait for the app, because we've got a voting system on the app, and if it's working well, it means that I guess the questions that want to get asked should rise to the top, but I guess doesn't seem to be working. And
has anybody posted questions?
yeah, so if you have an individual question. Yeah. Sorry, we're waiting for a mic. So could you just quickly introduce yourself as well, please? Thank you.
Yes, my name's Anil Khanna. I'm an owner-operator. And my question relates to the franchises that, you sign an agreement and there's 8%, 9% franchise fee, but actually that's not actually what you end up paying because there's a lot of hidden costs, and to do with whether it's performance marketing, whether it's to do with their loyalty program, and how you go back to getting that cost of acquisition accuracy without it's almost impossible, and the brands don't make it easy to get that information as well, in my experience.
Okay, so this is, I guess this is around transparency of the overall costs of running a franchise on your property and trying to get visibility of that. And is that going to be possible going forward, I guess?
I think it's a really interesting question because we work with independents and brands, and we look primarily at technology and automation and also at the commercial side. And the calculation of cost of acquisition is really difficult with brands because you'll get back and say, oh no, we don't pay for CRS. And you do, but you pay through your franchise fee. And it's completely opaque. So there is no simple answer to that. I think what you have to do in that situation is pick up the costs that you can see and the costs that you do know about and benchmark, so your resource costs, your commission costs, your marketing costs, so the things that are visible, and benchmark those to get a good understanding. But you're absolutely right, some of the pay-per-click and your CRS costs, etc., they're completely opaque in your franchise fee. Yeah.
So is Hotstats, given the level of detail, the number of line items, is it able to provide greater visibility to owners in terms of, I guess if you know your contracts and you know where those costs are likely to be, Is that going to help you in terms of benchmarking as well?
Well, yeah, because it's going to respond to one of the questions up
Yeah.
there. On the question that's up there, the uniform system is hugely helpful because that does set out where every line item is posted. Because we take from a general ledger extract, which means it is the rawest of data, we're going to repost it to uniform system of accounts, which not everybody uses, as I've said. So actually, when contributors get their data back, they may not recognise their own data as being the nominals that they see, the amounts they see in their own management accounts, but it is comparing apples with apples, which is the point that's being made up there on each individual line item. To the question about franchise fees, that's about transparency and the ability to challenge brands, which, you know, God help us if we start into that today, because we've got no brand representation on the panel apart from the Marriott. But I think that's something else completely, I would contend. I mean, disagree with me by all means.
I mean, I think from our point of view, we recognise that must be a real issue if I don't know how many hotels you own and run, but if it's 1, 2, 3, 4, even 10, you probably don't have the width of experience with multiple brands that would really help understand that. I mean, even for us running multiple brands, I mean, IHG, all different brands, Hilton, different brands for them, Marriott, different brands under that, Accor as well. We've experienced all the brands, but even when we move into a new brand, like we've started with Accor over the last kind of 12 or 18 months, we had no experience of working with them before. Even us as experienced operators franchising for several years really struggled with understanding the cost that were going to come from there, because it's not even about the brands doing the same thing and having the costs squirreled away. They all do it very differently, and even for us, we find that very difficult. So if we're pitching to win a hotel and we think X, Y, or Z brand is the best brand for a hotel, but we don't maybe actually operate a lot of them yet, then that's a real difficulty for us. And we've had issues sometimes. You think the cost base is going to be X, and actually it turns out to be Y, because there was things we didn't even pick up through the process. So I can completely understand that.
Okay, so there's still a need in that area to create greater transparency. I mean, it sounds like we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, in defence of brands, they are leading the charge in understanding cost base and wanting to provide better returns to owners. So I think there is a huge piece of work being done by them to provide better returns and increase transparency. There's some great questions coming.
There is. Let's take the top one. We've got three likes on that. Should RevPAR be calculated after commissions to get a true comparable? I think there's been some discussion. I've yet to hear it on a. I think it's a great question. Who would like to have a look at that first in terms of a response?
I think it's two different things. So it speaks very nicely to what we were talking about earlier about cost of acquisition. So if you want to manage on a net basis, you have to take all of your costs and not just your commissions. And in some cases, your resource costs or your system costs may be higher than your commissions. So yes, you do need to know what that net effect is, but I think it's two different metrics and both of them are important.
Okay, so it's not really, I think then the response is it's not just about commissions, right? That's just one piece. Yeah. And I guess we touched on that. That will only then give you another piece of the picture, but it's not the whole picture, right? And it could be misleading.
Yeah.
Okay, is anybody providing or using F&B revenue benchmarking?
Yeah.
As an advertorial.
Yeah, sorry, we don't know this. But yeah, and it's critical because one of the schisms that we've seen in hotel performance is a growth in rooms revenue, which hasn't necessarily translated to a growth in net RevPAR and therefore profit. But again, an eye to the RevPAR line says everything is good, and a massive diminution in the non-rooms revenue coming through the business. So if you take Dublin as an example, which in the last 10 years has grown its RevPAR massively, if it had just maintained pace in terms of a revenue per room sold with where it was 10 years ago, each hotel would have added 340,000 euros to its revenue line. But it's kind of, things have moved on. So the external influences of more restaurant brands coming in, more choice, people's attitudes about food and beverage consumption has moved away from a captive in-hotel dining or eating or consumption experience. I think that there's a paucity of understanding about how you measure conference and banqueting revenue in particular, and an ability to drive that and professionalise that, which I think could be the next revolution within the sector. But absolutely critical, and yeah, there's loads of benchmarking around it.
I mean, I can just add, I mean, one of the biggest conversations we are having with owners at the moment is around food and beverage and catering revenues. You know, they are not where we would like them to be. I echo completely Jonathan's point around, you know, rooms RevPAR growth not being reflected in terms of F&B, and actually some of our owners are, you know, moving us towards the outsourced route as well. So we have a great working relationship with Carluccio's now. We've got another restaurant being built at the Marriott at Heathrow at the moment, and also Brasserie Blanc as well. So, you know, where we're also trying to develop our own brand within Marriott as well, but on a selective basis, we are actually looking at outsourcing on F&B.
So would you then look to a revenue per square metre measure, which is something else which actually isn't a kind of accepted performance measure within the industry? Because
we've just gone back round again to actually make sure that our measurements of our C&E space and outlet space are actually accurate as well, because it's such a big piece of work with one significant ownership group this year.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. What is GOP to flow through, and how do you measure it? So,
David, do you want, I'm conscious I'm doing too much talking.
That's fine. I would imagine that, to be honest, this is something that probably varies across different operators that use it. The way it works for us personally, and actually we've just taken on a new group of hotels and realised they do it exactly the same, which is good, is in essence, you look at your kind of, it only goes down to GOP, so you look at your revenues and how they perform against budget, is how we do it. And then for every single cost line, you assess whether that should move or how it should move in line with that revenue stream or any given revenue stream, or if it should move at all, or if it's a fixed cost or whatever it is. And what that then allows you to do is to then assess, well, let's say a certain segmentation of revenue was 10% down on budget, then that would imply that any direct costs related to that should also be 10% down on budget. So if they're 8% down, you know, great. If they're 12% down, then bad. And it's kind of sort of as simple as that. And it's not rocket science as such, but what it allows you to do that you couldn't do if you weren't looking at it is you'd be looking at a revenue number that was down and a cost number that was probably down, but trying to tie up if the cost had dropped by more or less than it should have becomes difficult. So that's the way we operate it. So.
It's just an important measure because, I mean, essentially it's marginal revenue, and the flow through to marginal profit is really what you're trying to get in the best percentage conversion. And where we've seen so much more variable cost introduced to the business through, amongst other things, OTA commissions and so on, it's another erosion.
I mean, just a point on that, we created asset management courses for students, and we've taken, I think, around 1,200 students through asset management courses over the last 2 years, and all of them we've taught about GOP flow through. So you're going to have a whole raft of students coming and going, okay, where's GOP flow through? How does that work? So sorry about this, but I think it's good to have that dialogue, you know, going, and I think it is a very important metric going forward.
You're getting a wind-up signal from the back.
I'm getting what? Is that it? Can I have a quick wrap up? Is it dead? I didn't see the light. Is there a light?
It's pointing this way. That's right.
Oh, that's it. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Sorry, everyone. We've kind of overrun. Just a very quick wrap up from the panelists. Kind of last takeaway, if you'd like to give one.
Puddles and lakes. That's mine.
Okay.
Yeah. Take the time to do your deep dive into your acquisition costs.
Yeah, for us as owners have obviously got finite resources, and it's how best to deploy them. Is it systems? Is it people? Is it a balance between the two? So.
Okay, great. Makes sense. Anthony?
I think for me it's about staying the course. I think I said earlier on, I think, you know, when you're using benchmarking, whether it's internal or external, it's very easy for it to become a sporadic tool which gets picked up and put down. I think if you want to drive real change and bottom line improvement, it has to become part of your natural business rhythm. with sponsorship throughout the business as well. And it's only going to be one part of the business that gets more focus from owners.
Great, thank you.